Hi, and thank you for joining me for another video. And friends, today I want to speak to you about the Jewish practice of praying on or near Jewish graves, even literally praying to or through the dead. And this for sure is one of the most important videos I've done so far, as you will see. So you're probably thinking, what's the big deal with involving a cadaver in your prayers? Honestly, who are you hurting, or even praying to angels, when even every Shabbat, everyone does it, right? In that infamous portion in Shalom Aleichem. So what's the big deal? They'll say, this is Judaism. Heck, I didn't make up the rules, and who do you think you are, Asher, coming here and trying to change things? Well, the truth is that not only does the practice of involving the dead and angels in our prayers to God have a negative effect on us, friends, it ultimately taints the message of ethical monotheism to all those who hear about it. Actually, the Rambam writes in his Yud Gimel Kar Emunah in Principle 5 that Hashem, blessed be He, is worthy that we serve Him, to glorify Him, to make known His greatness, and to do His commands. And not to do this to those who are beneath Him in creation, not to the angels or to the stars or the planets or anything else. For there are all created things in nature, and there is no choice or judgment except by God Himself. Also, it is not fitting to serve them as intermediaries to God. Only to God should you incline your thoughts and your actions. This is the fifth principle, and it warns against idolatry, and most of the Torah speaks out against this. So to this, someone who would visit the Kivrei Tzadikim, the graves of the righteous, in prayer, would then say, actually, the truth is that you will honestly get a different answer on what they're actually doing depending on who you ask. Because the sources are all across the board, from praying directly to the dead, that they should either answer you themselves, beseech God for you, or the later understanding as brought down in the Mishnah Berurah, that one should only pray at graves so that in the merit of the lifeless cadaver, God should bother to listen to you. But regardless, to virtually all these, they claim that it does not in any way resemble an idolatrous practice. And friends, I'm in no way holding the Rambam's 13 principles as authoritative in themselves, but rather only authoritative in the Torah principles they are rooted in, which is really an approach we should all take with any rabbi who did not physically sit on the court themselves, which is actually a concept that ironically applies to the topic at hand, because in this case you do have authentic mumchim, rabbis who may have sat on the court, the great court, the Sanhedrin, stating that there actually was a practice of consulting the ancestors through praying. Then others in the same court telling us what a despicable practice it really was. So what do? And this is really what is going to make this so educational, the inyan of the concept of chazal versus chazal, which not only teaches us that if Chazal disagreed with Chazal, or many of the Rishonim or even Achronim disagreed with Chazal in the sense of taking differing opinions within Chazal, how much more can we? In other words, defending everything uttered by an Amar or a Tana as if it was God speaking Himself is really, I'm sorry to say, a ridiculous notion. Then someone will say, Rabbi Asher, how about Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, that even these and these are the words or the opinions of the living God? That statement uttered in Chagiga. To that I'd say, man, that's also a midrash, or agadic in nature, which really should be the only way to respond. But honestly, if you had to give a response, you would understand Elu ve'elu, like when the Rambam explains, how can someone say Asher kedeshara mitzotav vetzivanu, that God has sanctified us through His commandments and has commanded us regarding every mitzvah or practice established by a chazal and not Torah or God, like lighting Hanukkah candles, etc. So the Rambam explains that that would fall under the mitzvah of lo tasur, of not straying from the rulings of the court. In other words, by listening to and adhering to the rulings of the judges, this in some ways is equivalent to listening to the commands or even the words of God Himself, to the point that Hashem phrases it that way in Parashat Shoftim, that by not adhering to their rulings, we would be sinning against God Himself. Now, could Chazal have said things a little clearer in Shas? Absolutely. Do their statements more times than not hurt more than they help? You better believe it. And should we feel obligated to justify every idea uttered by them, no matter how twisted it may be? Absolutely not. Because again, one principle every Torah Jew must understand is that we were never commanded to believe Chazal or the sages, but only to obey. And even in the realm of obeying, this does not include doing practices that contradict Torah or the spirit of Torah. Actually, we have a direct mitzvah not to follow the majority, to do evil, which even Chazal stated this refers to the court. Now, one could even say that it could even possibly sometimes be a mitzvah to break a halakha, in theory. As a matter of fact, there's a complete masechet in the Gemara, known as Tractate Hariyot, that deals with this very issue, which is also codified by the Rambam in Hilchot Shegagot. Not to say that we're commanded in any way in Talmudic law to pray to or through cadavers, because we're not. Just Rather, if you would stumble across anything that contradicts Torah, no matter who may have said it, know that halakhically we still answer to a higher authority. So you already know the model that at Dordale we don't tell you what to think, but rather teach you how to think halakhically, and regarding this case, ethically also. Which does not mean blindly following Achronim or even Rishonim, but hopping into the Mishnaic sources themselves to get the purest perspective. And friends, sometimes it would even be a perspective like this that makes you think that many of the early Talmudic rabbis with real smicha actually had and were knee-deep into pagan customs. And friends, it's not just my opinion, but being that there was a debate and disagreement amongst themselves shows us that many of the sages may have held themselves incompetent regarding many issues. Which is, if you think about it, should really make us focus more on Torah Shebiktav, on the written law, and completely rethink the twisted notion of Yeridat Hadorot, the idea that older by definition always means better religiously. And really, friends, what should really completely put an end to this practice from the outset is the clear Torah prohibition of consulting the dead. To the point that there the Almighty even calls it a toeva and an abomination. Not to mention the pasuk in Kohelet that reminds us that the dead know nothing. So what do Chazal have to say regarding the practice of praying around graves? Friends, we will go through everywhere in Shas that the notion of praying in graves is mentioned to really get a grasp on the situation. So in Masechet Ta'anit, the Gemara brings down two opinions for the custom of visiting the cemetery during fast days. And the Gemara here clearly states that there are two different opinions. The first is that of Rabbi Levi that states that the reason we would go there is to signify that we are as the dead before the Almighty. And thus he should have mercy on us. In other words, ultimately, for the teshuvah that it may stir in our hearts, being surrounded by others who held the same fate. However, the second opinion is brought down by Rabbi Hanina, which states that they went in order that the dead should intercede for mercy on their behalf. And if you notice, it does not state that we should pray to them or in any way focus on a specific kever or any grave. So here you have it. We have a minhag and two polar opposite historical opinions. Who's right? Well, if you ask me, they shouldn't have created this stupid custom of visiting the cemetery to begin with. But regardless, we first have an inyan that doesn't seem theologically problematic at its outset, and another that on its own takes upon itself to theorize a lot of metaphysical possibilities, such as that one, that the dead around us are still in their graves, and two, that they are spiritually conscious in some way of us needing prayer and could hear our request, and three, that they in some way have a direct connection or communication with God. Either way, in itself, it would fall into the sin of delving into the secrets of the divine, like it says in Deuteronomy 29, that the secret things are for God and only the revealed things are for us and our children, not to mention the direct Torah prohibition of beseeching the dead that we mentioned earlier. In other words, if someone would make such a statement and then follow it with that is my opinion or the opinions of others, but not Torah, then the damage would not be so great. But to blatantly try to build hashkafa on a topic that honestly Chazal did not know more on than we do today is not just ridiculous, but irresponsible. So what I'm trying to tell you, friends, is that no one knows more than what Torah states regarding what happens to us in the grave. No one. And worse, to go as far from a halakhic perspective to institute a possible custom on your baseless assumption is just halakhically irresponsible. And friends, one major point that the proponents of beseeching the dead miss here in this sugya is that this does not appear anywhere in the Mishnah, which means that what they were doing was only commenting on the practice of visiting graves and not in any way establishing a new halakhic paradigm. Actually, this is how the Rambam and even the Shulchan Aruch held. In other words, they completely disagreed with Rabbi Hanina's opinion when bringing down this minhag. So it's not Rabbi Asher here fighting the mystics on this one, alone at least. Like I said, even the Shulchan Aruch, the code everyone claims to go by, holds that Rabbi Hanina was incorrect. Now the Ramam is another story. Who would have imagined? And friends, this is really an important time for us to remember the reason for us doing what we do rabbinically. And that's not completely dependent on the actual reason given, but rather because we're commanded to adhere to the court's rulings. But friends, I also think I should share another important principle here that is really paramount when learning or understanding halakha. And that's that unlike the mitzvot in the Torah, there actually always has to be a reasonable idea, concept, or historical precedence for us keeping rabbinic mitzvot. Why? Because these mitzvot or halachot were developed ultimately to either guard or explain inyanim in Torah and not as new pillars in themselves. Which is why now, friends, I'm going to discuss how Rishonim and even Amoraim decided to either include, exclude, or justify Mishnaic or Talmudic statements or rulings in their codifications of halakha. Because here, my friends, is where the disconnect began. And friends, the truth is that most of the Tanaim or Amoraim did not always know the reason for the statements or rulings that they were handed over. Actually, I would say that the vast majority of explanations in Shas for the reason of rabbinic rulings were lost to them. Because remember, in the manner that the Mishnah and the Gemara came into existence, basically everyone at one time was asked to bring down everything they heard their teacher teach, and the notes that were collected, and the opinions that may have been preserved. And the result was a portable rabbinic law that Israel could practice in Galut, in the diaspora. So I'm sure that you in no way think that rabbinic Judaism or the opinions of the rulings within it began with Hillel and Shammai. Even though the words of the Sukkot, Tanaim, Amoraim is all you see. No, friends, they were just quoting earlier courts and more than half the time guessing what the possible reason for the ruling may have been. Which is why you have many times Tanaim debating what the actual reason was behind the ruling. Both claiming to have an authentic Masorah. To the point that we even see Rishonim excluding supposed halachot and Shas because they felt that the reason wasn't good enough, or that it may have developed because of some earlier pagan custom, no matter which court may have ruled on it. Because like I said, friends, that this is a very important principle to properly understanding halakha. And again, that unlike mitzvot in the Torah, rabbinic rulings, or what may have been brought down by the court, have to make sense or be tied into some logical framework. If not, it gets disposed of. Now, how did they determine which ruling or minhag to do away with? Easy. The reason for every halakha had to either be altruistic, based on common sense, or linked to a mitzvah in the Torah. In other words, if anything may have seemed backward or ethically not progressive, it would have not been carried over. And this had to be the criteria that Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's court used in determining what to include or exclude from the Mishnah. But again, we have to do away with the notion that only because a generation was closer to Mount Sinai, that this in some way made that generation any wiser. Because again, we're dealing with fallibility, sages in our case, that never thought to be made into saints, or the modern perverted notion of what a tzaddik is today. And this is really yet another problem on how nowadays we romanticize the era of the Geonim or the Rishonim, honestly placing too much weight on the notion of Masorah as an excuse to accept everything blindly. And friends, the simple fact is that if your Masorah cannot be verified by something in Torah or something in the Mishnah from at least an ethical perspective, it should be and has historically been tossed out of halakha, which teaches us that Masorah, in terms of how we should validate halakha, is really useless if it does not pass the test. Why? Because the rabbinic was never meant to be or to be seen as an end unto itself, like it has become today, but a means to a greater end. And that end is the proper execution of the written law, the Torah. And this is something we even see the Rambam doing, dropping certain possible halachot, or even holding differently in a handful of areas than his predecessor. Of course, this was before the deification of the rabbis. Nowadays, not only do we not toss out unethical ideas, but rather we try to hold by every opinion all at once and never think twice about it. And this is really one of the biggest downfalls of the Kabbalistic movement, that took plain uninspired law and made it mystical, which gets later generations assuming that because there is now a mystical reason for the rabbinic practice, no matter how backward and unethical it may be, it must remain. Ultimately, because they have made the keeping of halakha another form of avodah zarah. Because ultimately, what's avodah zarah? What's avodah zarah? And it's not just foreign worship or any necessarily outwardly form of evil in itself, but evil in the sense that it wastes and dilutes our most important commodity, our time. But not to get too far off the topic, the next place where this notion of praying to the dead is mentioned is in Sota 34b, that states regarding the verse in Numbers 13:22. And they ascended in the south, and they arrived at Hebron. And it should have said, and they arrived in Hebron. Rava said that this teaches us that Caleb disassociated himself from the plans of the spies and went alone to Hebron and prostrated himself at the graves of the patriarchs. He said to them, "My fathers, ask for mercy upon me that I may be saved from the plans of the spies." So here, it doesn't only have Caleb praying, as it said, but it has them prostrating on the kever and praying directly to Avram Avinu, a custom later performed and condoned by the Arizal and his followers, which is basically how they justify the practice today. And this inyan, apart from appearing in Shas, also appears irresponsibly by Rashi in his commentary. Well, first of all this is speculation. It's folklore. In other words, it does not appear anywhere in Torah. And friends, I have to tell you that many of the Meforshim had a huge problem with this sugya, to the point that even Tosfos could not believe what Rava was saying and adamantly began to give an alternative interpretation to his words. Why? Because it was infringing on the direct mitzvah of not beseeching the dead. Now, the sages in the Talmud were against this practice and developed certain ordinances to keep Israel away from this perversion, the perversion of beseeching the dead. To the point that Talmud Yerushalmi, in response to this practice, teaches us that one should not erect a monument on the gravesite of righteous people, to the extent that the Talmud even states that a righteous person should be remembered by his or her actions alone. And even Chazal teach that this is a reason for us not knowing where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried, lest we turn to him towards prayer, or use him as some sort of an intermediary between ourselves and God. And this is even brought down by the Rambam. He states that a person should not walk Abraham of a gravesite with tefillin in his hand or a Sefer Torah in his arm, nor should he pray there. And here it's not even referring to praying to the dead, but to Hashem alone. To discredit all those who teach that this in some way teaches us that we could pray there as long as there's a mechitza of arba amot. To the extent that Chazal themselves in Yerushalmi directly prohibited us from praying to anyone but God himself, if the restrictions in Torah were not enough for you. It states that if a person experiences tragedy, do not cry out to angels, to Michael, to Gabriel, but rather to the Holy One, blessed be He. And this prohibition is halachic in nature, unlike Rabbi Hanina or Rava's statement about the possible historic use of graves. So friends, what's the main issue here? Is this as bad as saying Mazel Tov or Siman Tov or any other pagan concept that has crept into everyday Jewish life? Friends, unfortunately, this is ultimately worse. And not just because it infringes on a direct Torah command of not beseeching the dead, or just because it resembles pagan practices of old, but mainly because it strips away honor and glory from the Almighty by attributing redemptive qualities to something that was created and has died. In other words, anything outside of the Almighty himself. And this is how the Rambam actually describes the birth of Avodah Zorah and Chilchos Avodah Zorah. It states that they perceive this to be the will of God, that they magnify and honor those who he magnified and honored. In our case, the rabbis, just as a king desires the servants who stand before him to be honored. Indeed, doing so is an expression of honor to the king. After conceiving this notion, they began to construct temples to the stars and offer sacrifices to them. They would praise and glorify them with words and prostrate themselves before them, because by doing so, they would, according to their false conception, be fulfilling the will of God. And this ultimately led to the birth of idolatry. So friends, if you're hearing me today and you feel you may have stumbled in this area, friends, it's never too late to get back on the right path. For more information on everything Jewish, my friends, please visit doordea.com. Thank you.